Okay, so I'm going to talk tonight. This is about a question that a student asked me in class a couple days ago, and it got me thinking about something that I haven't talked about in a little while. And the question is basically concerning individual expression or like artistic license. Basically, when your practice becomes an art. And it is wrong to say that you are, an artist from the beginning, where you are creating things and being creative and kind of doing things your way from the beginning, at least as far as where your intention should be. Your intention should be to do it the right way, which is the way that you're told to do it. It's also wrong to say that you only ever do it that way forever and you just do the technique like exactly the way that you were taught, with no variation, with no creativity, although it's much closer to that than it is to the first one. The creativity more comes into play and the art comes more into play with what's going on inside of you. And so I'll talk about that. But it reminds me of a part of Kodo. Kodo is a great book. You can't find it anywhere, so I've got one of the last remaining copies. It's on sale for $1,000. So this is by Kenshiro Furuya, a great Aikido practitioner, and he talks about the 3 stages in traditional training. And he's an Aikido practitioner, so this is more Japanese, but the same ideas in different styles of martial arts, more or less. And he says that. He says, there are 3 stages in traditional training. Musashi spoke of 5 levels in his book. In Rinzin Zai, they discuss 10 stages of training. Some Zen masters believe there are 12 or 15 stages. Sekyun, a well-known swordsman of the 17th century, spoke of 3 stages, which is accepted as basic to all Japanese-style martial arts training. The 3 stages are known as Shu Ha Ri. Shu means the protecting stage. So the symbol for this stage, and there are these nice illustrations in the book, which you probably can't see if you're watching on the internet or if you have bad vision in here. But the first stage is this one, and it's basically like a chick in an egg. And so it means the first stage is hard. In other words, the form or shape of the technique must be mastered or protected, just as the mother bird protects her egg. Also, the hard shell of the egg symbolizes the beginning fundamental form. So this is what I talk about when I'm talking about becoming a technician. So you have to become a technician first before you can become an artist. And I tell this story all the time, and I'm going to tell it again. We had somebody come in our school back in Michigan who wanted to practice Tai Chi, and I asked everybody, have you practiced Tai Chi before? And he says, yes. I basically just go in my garage and move. I just move. And I laughed very hard inside, but outside I said, interesting. So this is what we do. And then I explained this to him later on, but you have to practice technique that has something behind it, some kind of thought process that went into it, some kind of logic, some kind of methodology for creating it. This is something that's been honed over centuries. Thousands, millions of people have done these techniques and figured out the way that it works and the way that it doesn't work. And we're very lucky. I'm not making this stuff up. This is stuff that I've learned from other people who've practiced it for many years, and they've learned it from other people who practiced that stuff for many, many years. And so this is something that has undergone a real process of honing and perfection. And it is not perfect today, but it is way more perfect than if you just went in your garage and moved around and tried to figure it out. A lot of it is natural movement. A lot of it is stuff that obviously goes well with the way that you move your body. because if we try to completely learn everything from scratch and start all over, it's going to take a lot longer. But also, your body moves pretty well, pretty naturally, the way that it's meant to move. But then there's a whole lot of stuff that is natural that is absolute crap for self-defense, if we're talking about Kung Fu. And there's a lot of ways that you might move, even if you're talking about like Tai Chi, that it makes sense if you're doing it in the short term, but in the long run, over many, many repetitions, your body's going to start to break down. But back to the self-defense idea, a very natural movement for you, if somebody's punching at your face, is to go like this. And closing your eyes does not make the punch disappear. They will still punch you in the face. That's bad habit. Closing your eyes is only good instinct because it protects your eyes, but you're still getting knocked out. And they can still, keep kicking you while you're on the ground. So there's a lot of stuff that our bodies do that we do need to unlearn, at least in the hope of, in the process of finding what is the best possible way of dealing with this. So this is what I also call being a scientist versus being a caveman. A scientist really thinks and tinkers and studies and perfects and does experiments and goes over and over and over again until it really makes sense. They understand this thing, and it is very important to us in the beginning of our practice to understand. You should understand how the body moves. You should also understand why the body moves that way. You should not just be blindly following. Now, if you have been here long enough, you probably trust me that I'm not just going to tell you something that's garbage that doesn't have a good how or why behind it. But if you don't, you should certainly ask, why do we do that? And even if you do trust me, but you're still curious about it, or you think it might help you to do the technique better, ask, why do we do it that way? Why do we punch this way versus this way? Why do we have the thumb here instead of inside the fist? And that all is going to be an aid for you in the first stage. So the next stages, the next one is called Ha. So the second stage of training is Ha, breaking form. The symbol is a young chick breaking out of its shell. So this is a very wonderful cartoon here of a chick violently breaking out of its shell. At this secondary stage, the basic form is broken into its infinite applications. It means the fundamentals are mastered and are now applied in all situations. So this is, you hear me talk all the time about principles. The idea of a principle is fairly simple. It's like this. You learn different punches. You learn a punch that we call a front punch or a reverse punch, a hook punch, an uppercut. Well, they have distinctions, they have differences, but then they have many things, more things that are the same between the different punches. These are principles. Things like making a tight fist, keeping your wrist straight, punching with the top two knuckles. Things like rotating and turning from your hips to generate more power. Things like, the way that you're rotating your shoulder, shifting the weight. So when you start to put that stuff together, first of all, in earlier stages, that helps you learn the technique, the specifics of a front punch versus the specifics of a hook punch versus the specifics of an uppercut. And being able to recognize, okay, in all of these things, I'm making the fist, I'm turning my hips, all that stuff. It helps you to learn things faster. But there's another part of the principle, which is, the truth is, on some level, there is just punch. We call this, this flavor of it an uppercut. We call this flavor of it a hook punch, and we call this flavor of it a front punch. But it's just varying degrees of the same thing, right? And you can truthfully throw an uppercut anywhere from here to here, and then it kind of becomes a hook punch. And then if it comes like this, it's straighter and becomes a front punch or reverse punch. But you could throw something that's in between those things, and if the principles are there, it's still going to work. As long as your fist is tight, you're not going to hurt your hand. As long as your wrist is straight, you're not going to hurt your wrist. As long as you're shifting your weight and turning your hips, you're going to generate power. Now, you can't just start by looking at the general things and throw it 100 different ways, because through muscle memory, through lots of repetition, you're conditioning your body to do it these ways, and you want that to be very specific. But in this next stage, it's basically like I'm starting to recognize on an intellectual level, but also more like on something deeper, like almost like an emotional level, I guess. This is something where I'm starting to become free of needing to do the technique the very specific way, exactly this way that I've been taught, because I recognize, hey, there's this other application that I have to be able to do, or I'm grappling and I've done something that's like this, but that technique doesn't work right now because of what my partner's doing. Likely there is a technique or something that exists that you could use to get out of this situation, but if you don't know it yet, you want to use something, you want to improvise using the principles, but still be able to create. So I'm not stuck. I'm not completely boxed in by exactly the way that I did this. Now, this second stage is a good ways away. As I said before in class, this is not where you should think that you are right now, because if you head too early into that, you're essentially just in your garage moving around. And this is like how a lot of people think that they're learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu these days, is they look at something, they look at a video on YouTube, they lay down some mats, they get a buddy to come over, and they kind of roll around and try to do it, and sometimes they break each other, and sometimes they don't, and it's like, I'm doing it, I'm doing Jiu-Jitsu. Or the same as people who are like, I'm going to look up on YouTube how to do Tai Chi, and I'm going to try to do it. You will get further along than if you just sat there by yourself without any resource and tried to make it up from scratch, but it's not going to work nearly as well as having this method in a class with people who know what they're doing, kind of helping you through it. But that being said, there is room for that in your practice. There's room for that improvisation. There's room for when you start to recognize the different applications that are not strictly taught in a very specific way in class. And then, so that's when I'm talking about kind of being like a. This is related. It's not exactly the same thing. It's more like my toothpaste analogy. So some of you guys have heard my toothpaste analogy. Some of you haven't. I can see because you're looking at me funny. The toothpaste analogy is like this. I have a tube of toothpaste. I thought about this because this is literally what I do with my toothpaste. And I basically mash out the toothpaste, and then I get to the very end, and that's like, the mashing out the toothpaste is like the first couple of classes where you come in here and you're like, I'm throwing punches just like everybody else. I'm so good. And then you realize, wait a minute, I'm doing a lot of things wrong. I need to work on the details. So this is like with the toothpaste. Now I see, okay, there's all this toothpaste left in there that I haven't gotten out yet, and I can keep just trying to smash it out, but I'm still going to miss some of those things and some of that detail in class. So then I start to methodically roll from one end of the toothpaste tube all the way down. And sure enough, once you get halfway or 3/4 of the way rolling that tube, then you get a little bit more toothpaste out. That's like in your technique. You start off just throwing stuff, and then you realize, okay, I got to put some thought into this. I have to really get the details. And then you'll start to eke out a little bit more power, a little bit more speed. You'll start to recognize, when I do it that way, my knee magically doesn't hurt anymore. And I'm not getting punched as often. This is great. So you're going to start to, methodically move through this thing, just like you're rolling out that toothpaste. And that is kind of like being a scientist. That is like the first stage. But then you have to be able to transcend that, and you kind of become like a caveman. The caveman, what I talk about in reference to the scientist versus the caveman, is like the scientist is thinking about it, the caveman is just doing it, just repping over and over again. The caveman also has the ability, or cavewoman, to not be up in their head thinking about it, just doing it, and there can be some creativity in there. There can be some, okay, this is just what happens when I allow myself to just do and to just be. Caveman is not trying to think. Now, I'm not saying anything about Caveman. I keep thinking about the Geico commercial, like there's an actual caveman out there who's going to watch this talk and be pissed off at me for saying this. Clearly cavemen were thinking about stuff because, we eventually figured it all out. Fire and the wheel and all that good stuff. But what I mean is, in general, if you think of a caveman versus a scientist, they're not thinking so much. They're just doing it, right? And this is necessary to get that repetition, but it's also necessary to just feel things and get in the flow of your practice, right? But then there's the next stage, which is Ri. So the third stage is called Ri, which is releasing form. The chick has matured into a young bird and flies away from the nest. It means in the third stage of mastery, the student forgets all forms and masters the formless technique, leaving old ideas behind him. In short, he is fully matured in his training. So this idea is this is not where I would say that I am, although traditionally it's like if you leave the school of your teacher, you're supposed to be, you mastered it and you're on your way to the next thing, like figuring it out on your own. But there are certainly things that I've started to try to figure out on my own and put my own spin on things in my own practice and in the way that I teach. This is years down the road where you are really just allowing the practice to flow through you, and you are able to spontaneously create, but maybe even kind of create okay, this is something that I've been struggling with in grappling, and there's nothing that exists to deal with this that I know of, but I can do this follows the principles, and it makes sense, and it's something that I kind of start to rep myself, and it's almost like making up a technique. You of course have probably not been the very first person to come up with this, because there have been so many people doing it in the past that likely somebody else has done it. Very likely we talked about it in class at some point and you just weren't paying attention. But there's got to be some of that happening at the very later stages of your growth and practice, where you really are, this is the formless form, or this is the technique that is beyond technique. This is kind of going back to that idea of, all right, I'm punching, but it is a punch. It doesn't have a name specifically. It just does what it does naturally. And me standing here and explaining it, my poor attempt at explaining it, is not going to do it any justice and not really help any of us understand what it is, but just kind of recognize that there is that something beyond there where we are not there, essentially. Grab that, the brush painty thing that I have in there. I was thinking about this talk earlier today, and I was thinking about this in terms of the way that I answered the question in class the other day, which is that when you really become an artist, it is not really about what you are physically doing or creating. It's more about the function of what's going on inside of you. Thank you for not letting it spill. Excellent work. I didn't even have to tell you that. So it's more like about, let's see if I can not let it spill. Okay. So it's more like about how am I transformed as a human being? How is my emotional and mental state changed, both in this moment but also over the long term, over practice? I am the canvas that is being painted on. It is not me doing the art. Art cannot come from, or at least in my opinion, true art cannot come from the ego or the small self. True art has to flow from something that basically you're connecting to. It's like, all music is just out there, and you're just kind of like tapping into something if you're writing music, which is a process that I don't do at all, but I can kind of get it through martial arts. And you might experience this if you're doing, if you're sparring, if you're doing sticky hands or push hands in Tai Chi, where you step out of the way and it happens because you weren't there to stop it. This is like, I use this thing as a very simple example to help you understand, because when we create art, or what we think of as art, it's like I'm trying to make a thing. There's like a purpose to it, and there's usually this attachment to it. So I have just been drawing circles. Let's see if I can draw a good circle right now. That's okay. It's not a very good circle. But you see, it's there. And if I get attached to it, I'm like, this circle, this is the best circle that's ever existed. It's so perfect. And then I kind of hold on to it. It's like I got to make all my other circles exactly like that. And I think about this, and I really get stuck on it. But this thing's really cool because it's starting to disappear, as you can tell. This is kind of the idea that I'm trying to get at, is all this stuff that we're doing in life and on the planet, for the most part, is fleeting. It's going to disappear someday. And if we recognize that, and we recognize that this is the real nature of things, the real nature of art, it becomes easier to not be attached to it. It's going to disappear. It's like a magic trick. It's very cool. You can take this from me. Thank you. I'm going to end up spilling it or something. So what you want to get at is like the idea of the art belonging to me, or of a technique belonging to me, or this thing that I do as being of me, is what's in the way. There really should be no you in the way. There should just be me stepping out of the way. And this is like what Mushin is. This is the whole idea of no mind. Your little mind is not there trying to do anything. There is nothing trying to happen. It just happens of itself, of its own accord. So I got to get to the last thing with the toothpaste. So what you do with the toothpaste is you roll it and you get to that last little bit, and then it's like, okay, I've kind of gotten to the end of what I can get purely by just thinking about the technique, and purely by repping the technique. And this is kind of like what I mean by transcending that and getting out of the way, is you just have to kind of go back to caveman mode. And that last little bit, that's, how the tube is like circular at the top, and you have to just like shove your thumb in there to get that last little bit out. That's like emotional content. That's like I'm no longer thinking about it. I'm no longer in the way. I just go hard, push. And with your technique, you'll notice you start off sloppy and it's bad. You clean it up, it gets really good. You rep it like crazy and you throw it really hard. But if it's still you throwing it, it's going to be slightly slower. It's going to be, your response time is going to be slower, just by a hair, compared to if you are no longer there, because then there's nothing there to stop it. It's like you're a very thin, you are super thin like plug in the bottom of the bathtub, and you just yank it out, and then it can just flow through very quickly and very powerfully. And this is what we want to be able to do in our practice. And with meditation, the same thing. You have the same kinds of stages in meditation practice, where I start off really, I'm very almost rigidly sitting in a very specific way, and I'm, really keeping my mind exactly where I want it to be, by almost this kind of painful returning to the breath and telling myself, no, you're not supposed to be thinking right now. You're supposed to be meditating. Come back to that. Why are you doing that? But then you have the next stage where you really just get great at accepting exactly where you are with your meditation, and just, allowing it to happen. And then these higher stages of flow, where I sit and, I'm getting to these other states of consciousness, peace or bliss, where it's not happening because I'm making it happen. It's happening because I'm not there. I'm not in the way. So this is kind of like Bruce Lee talking about emotional content, as you're just getting that last little bit out. It's not coming from you, it's just coming. I had a few other quick things. Oh, I got a good story. It kind of relates to this. I wouldn't say perfectly, but it's the story that I thought of anyways. There's a young man whose father is a swordsman back in the day in Japan, and he's a well-known swordsman, very respected, but he's smart, so he knows that his son is not going to listen to him. So he sends him away to another, even more respected swordsman on like the other side of the island. And he says, "You're going to go practice with this man." And so the boy shows up, knocks on the door, and the old man comes out. He says, "What do you want?" He's like, I was sent here by my father to train with you, sir." And he says, "Oh." And the boy says, "Sir, I'm going to try so hard. I'm going to be a great student. How long is it going to take me to master the sword?" And the master can tell he's a little bit impatient. He's already thinking about, when am I going to be done with this? And so the master says, 10 years. And the young boy says, "Sir, that's so long. What if I double my effort and I work harder than anybody has ever worked before? I've got to get this." The master says, "Oh, then it'll take you 20 years. And the boy says, "You don't understand. I need to get this. I need to get it fast. I'm gonna pour myself so hard into this. I'm gonna try so hard. I've got to get this. I'm gonna be the best there ever was." And the master says, "Well, in that case, you'll probably never get it." And the lesson with that part is like, that is ego. The ego trying to do, the ego trying to be, and like the stronger that is, and the more you are associating with the little self who needs to get it, who's putting a timeline on everything, or putting a limitation on it, the stronger you are attached to that, the more impossible it is to get. The master was not yanking his chain. He was telling him, really, you might never get it if you are so attached to the ego and you so need to get this. And so then their training commences. The boy begrudgingly agrees to doing this without knowing how long it's going to take. And so the master sets him up and he's having him do chores. And this is like a Karate Kid. He's basically sweeping the floor and he's cleaning the dishes and doing all of this. And he's just doing chores around the house. And he does this for months. And he understands, because it's a traditional kind of training in a traditional situation, but eventually he just gets fed up with it. And he goes to the master and he says, "Sir, I don't understand how sweeping your floor is going to make me better at the sword." And the master says, "I know you don't. Just keep doing it." And then one day soon after that, the master sneaks up behind the young student with a wooden bokken, a wooden sword in his hand. He sneaks up behind him and he just cracks him with it hard across the back. And the boy just yelps out and turns around and he's like, "What was that?" And the master just smiles and he walks away. And then the boy gets it. He's like, "Okay, this is part of my training." And he goes back and he's cleaning. And he just cleans again for days and nothing happens. And then the master sneaks up on him again and he cracks him again. And the boy is caught completely off guard. And this goes on and on for years and years. And then finally the boy becomes so aware of not only his external environment but also what's going on within him, that the old master can no longer sneak up on him. He tries to, and the boy is just completely aware of it at every turn. And so then they continued on with more of the kind of training that you would assume. He's teaching him how to use the sword, and he becomes one of the best swordsmen, supposedly, of all time in Japan. And this is kind of the way that practice can seem to us. It can seem like, why am I doing it this way? I don't get it. And there is this process at work there that is, some of it is certainly understandable with logic. A lot of it should be. But there are things at work that are beyond logic that you cannot get. You will not get with your logical mind, with the small self, with the ego. So you have to just dive in. This is like the talk a couple weeks ago about the idea of surrender. You have to surrender to the method. You have to surrender to the process. And by doing that, you can allow that small self to disappear and just do and just be. And that's when things start to flow through us. So it is really a process of forgetting your desires, forgetting your technique. I mean, people come in here to the dojo and they ask me, how long is it going to take me to get my black sash? They usually call it a black belt because they don't know that we practice with sashes. And sometimes I'm very blunt with them and I say, that's the wrong question to be asking. If that's what you're thinking about, it is going to seem way too long to you. And the truth is, most people who practice here will never get a black sash. You will definitely not get a black belt for a very long time until I start teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But it might take forever, literally. Like, you might have to come back in the next life and do it. And you got to be okay with that, because if you're not, it won't happen. And I can't say how many people that, I mean, I saw this quite often at Seafood Brown School in Michigan, because people think that they're ready. They are convinced that they're ready to be a black sash. And there, for a long time, were 0 black sashes. And I honestly, coming up that way with 0 black sashes, said to myself, guess I'm never going to get a black sash. Nobody else has done it. Why should I be able to do it? And then after I had been there for 5, 6, 7 years, I think, 7 years, I think, finally Dr. Utar Natchett got his black sash, and it was a test to watch. It was a process. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, so it's possible. And I still thought, well, it'll be nice if I get it, but I'm not hung up on it. And then, of course, as soon as I'm thinking that, then Seafood Brown pulls me into the office with a few other senior students, and he says, you guys are next. You're doing this next. And then it becomes like, okay, well, I guess it's happening. I guess it's on. But those first couple of years were really nice because I had no thought. I mean, I was thinking, I'm going to do exactly what Seafood tells me to do, but I'm not super attached to getting to a certain place in a certain time. That was for me probably because I was too young and naive and dumb on some level. But in that kind of naivete, there's also this great wisdom. there's this great freedom of not being bound by your desires and what you think should happen and the way that you think that things should be. So you want to have this kind of childlike quality to your practice, and the way that you look at the process of growing and of getting better and all of this. It's fun. It should be fun. In that fun, you can flow and you can let things flow through you. You're not attached to anything needing to happen on any certain time. You're not attached to needing to be better than anybody else. All this comparison just disappears. So we want to do this with our meditation, obviously, the same way. And I've, again, gone way over time. But when you sit tonight, imagine it's like, hey, I'm sitting for the first time, and this is fun. This is just like a fun experiment that I'm doing. And we'll see what happens. I'm not attached to the meditation being any kind of way. I'm not attached to having to get to any certain state of consciousness. I'm just going to sit and see what happens, and then just let it flow through me. Sit comfortably.